Right, good day to you. The Eastbourne Society have asked me to make a few short presentations on the various folk who built Eastbourne in a number of ways. And clearly the commercial life of the town is absolutely essential. So I'm going to mention a few of the people who, through their initiative and their enterprise, built some interesting businesses. I'm going to start with Thomas Stafford Gowland, and he was certainly a man of many parts. As I say, a finger in many pies. He came to Eastbourne in 1865 upon the death of his sister's husband. And his sister and her husband were running at the time what was called the Library, in Marine Parade at its junction with Seaside Road, opposite where the Shore View Hotel is now, really. And it was a private library, of course, and she wanted his help in sort of managing the business, and she had a young son at the time. And within a few years, Gowland had really taken over the library from his sister and branched out into photographic studios and would be involved in hiring out pianofortes and all of that sort of thing. And you can see here, I think it's a lovely thing at the bottom. It says newspapers lent by the hour, which I think is absolutely brilliant. He went into the printing business, and here's a picture of his shop in Seaside Road, just down from where the T.J. Hughes premises are. And he produced the first Eastbourne postal directory, which of course was absolutely crucial for those sort of coming to the town and wanting to know who's who and what's what. He was also involved in this. This building is called the New Hall, and this was constructed in 1879, and it later became the Tivoli Cinema in Seaside Road, now converted into apartments. But this was sort of a fairly low-cost concert hall that didn't actually do very well. He also was involved very closely for a time with the Theatre Royal, just down the road from there, now of course called the Hippodrome, and of course this was a more successful enterprise. But he didn't just sort of stop there. Just a little bit further down the road, you're standing really outside of the Leaf Hall, looking up the bottom end of Langley Road, and that sort of bullnose building, shaped building in the centre of the picture, started off as private baths and a laundry that Gowland ran. So he started to branch out into all sorts of activities. And then that only survived for 3 or 4 years, and then his Royal Marine Laundry moved to Winchelsea Road, which was sort of on the crumbles at the time in the St Andrews, Norway area. And you can see there that they're advertising splendid open-air drying grounds. And next door to that, he started a boat building business where he was responsible for building a lot of small craft, including some of the local fishing boats, and at the same time decided to start building bathing machines, and he was responsible for the construction of a lot of the 200 bathing machines that there were in Eastbourne. So you can see a range of activities. A publisher of the first Eastbourne directory, introduced what was called the fashionable list, again, which was absolutely essential for the upper crust visiting Eastbourne, because this list was produced, I think, on a weekly basis, and it showed who was in town and when they were prepared to receive visitors. And he also had an interest in the Eastbourne Gazette. He was a printer, as you've heard. He built boats and bathing machines. He ran a laundry. Oh, and he started off an auction house as well, involved in a theatre and concert hall, and ran the first steamship excursions from the pier. And he hired a ship called the Rapid, which was misnamed actually because it was very slow. He was a very, very keen swimmer. A great advocate of swimming in the early morning every single day of the year. A prime mover of the Eastbourne Swimming Club, held posts as secretary of the Eastbourne Flower Club, etc. So really an incredibly energetic chap. And here he is with his family. He actually died in 1923 at the age of 88. And here's his nephew on his right-hand side, the chap in the dark suit and the moustache. And he was Frederick Gowland Hopkins, born local lad in that library in Marine Parade, and his father died just after he was born. Went on to become a Nobel laureate and won the Nobel Prize in the 1920s for his pioneering work on vitamins. So, local lad made good. William Chapman and his son George. Chapman came here really as a young lad, early teens, with his family, moved from Bradford down to Eastbourne. And as it says there, he was Eastbourne's Mr. Horse and eventually became Eastbourne's Mr. Charabanc. Here's a lovely picture. This is on what he called Chapman's Corner, and this is quite deliberately done because he was a brilliant sort of marketeer and publicist, and he even labelled his shop so it would be noticed, and he wanted everybody to call it Chapman's Corner. This was on the corner of what's now Terminus Road and Seaside, where the fish and chip shop is, opposite the store that's just closed. I call him the Horse King because certainly by the 1870s he was providing regular freight services to Hastings and Brighton. He hired out a lot of local carriages for high-class visitors to Eastbourne. He ran 4 horse omnibus services to Ocklinge, Old Town, Meads and down into the East End to the Archery. He had 150 hansom cabs under his control, about 75% of the total local market. He had riding schools, and altogether it was said he had about 400 horses in harness. And because of all the land that he owned and operated from, he ended up being the town's largest business ratepayer in 1900. So a very, very enterprising chap. And here's a nice picture of what was then the corner of Victoria Place, the top end of Terminus Road now. It's one of his horse-drawn charabancs. And again, it's, I think these are just sort of lovely pictures, so characteristic of the time. And here we see all of his services advertised: carriages, saddle horses, riding lessons, and then gradually going into motor coaches as well. And these were sort of pleasure trips really, but he would also, with the same sort of outfit, provide a regular daily trip to Brighton by horse as well. And this is really quite a nice picture of his main yard. And this was situated between Cavendish Place and Susan's Road, just over half an acre. And what was interesting is that the stables were below, and all the drivers and the farriers and everybody else who worked with the horses were actually lived with their families He went into the motor charabanc business in 1909. He really was sort of quite put out by the Eastbourne Corporation starting off the first motor bus service in the country in 1903, because it brought to an end very quickly his horse-drawn omnibus business. He started in 1909 and he had 40 a few years later, just sort of after the First World War, and it actually ended up with 50 a little bit later on. A lot of local leisure trips, of course. Ran an express service to London up to 4 times a day. Actually had offices at Victoria to sell tickets. Gave tours of the lakes in Scotland, and actually brought about what we would now call package holidays in southern France and Italy, and it was all found for £2 a day, an all-in holiday. So here's the same stable area between Cavendish Place and Susan's Road, now of course occupied by taxis and charabancs, but the same arrangement is in place, that the drivers and the mechanics still live with their families above the premises, living on the job as it were, and these drivers were expected to spend the winter months on a comprehensive maintenance of their vehicles, with the expectation that they could run the whole summer without anything going wrong. And here's a nice picture of a party probably preparing to go abroad on one of these long-term trips. Once we get to 1917, fuel is rationed because of the First World War, and Chapman was actually fined for using fuel for leisure trips. And so he came up with this wonderful idea of putting a balloon on top of the bus, filling it with town gas, and would actually run up to London and back again using this bag of town gas. I just hope they had a no smoking policy. And again, as an example of his enterprise, he actually advertised, be patriotic and use coal gas. So he offered to convert vehicles for people so that they could use town gas. Here's a nice picture post First World War from the pier with the charabancs going off on trips to Pevensey, etc. His charabancs were always painted a primrose colour, and they were actually nicknamed the Eastbourne Canaries. And here's a shot in be round about 1923-24. You might notice on the side that Croydon is featured. It's very important that the Chara stopped at Croydon, because by this time, 1923, Croydon had become London's first airport. So it's quite important to get to the airport. Always the publicist and the marketeer, Eastbourne used to have a massive flower carriage procession, I suppose, and invariably Chapman was the winner of it, because he used to put so much effort in. And here's a nice bit of publicity. This is a postcard actually showing several of the Chapman charabancs processing down Grand Parade. And then later on, again as really a publicity stunt, he parked 50 of his charabancs in Devonshire Place, just to show what a large-scale company it was. So in terms of his sort of business acumen, he very often travelled with his parties, particularly abroad, to sort of test the water and make sure that everything was going properly. Excellent always at his marketing and publicity, booking offices both in Eastbourne and Victoria. When in 1920s his son Edward took over in 1917 when William died, his son Edward tried to raise capital locally to expand the business, and hoteliers in particular queued up to give money. They were so confident and so impressed by the activities of the company, they wanted to be part of it. As he started going further afield, particularly to the lakes and Scotland with his trips, he encountered no end of problems with traffic commissioners, because at the time each region of the country had a separate traffic commissioner with different rules and regulations, and he would be passing through 7 or 8 different traffic commission areas if he was going from, say, here to Scotland, and he had no end of trouble with that. Here's another nice picture, and finally we'll end with this. This is now defunct, I'm afraid, but these are the Southdown ticket offices at the entrance to his old yard between Cavendish Place and Susan's Road. Southdown the feature because in 1932 Edward Chapman sold the company to a little start-up from Worthing called Southdown Buses. So a story of sort of great enterprise and achievement. Robert Cooper you would have to call a polymath. Look at this. He was a chemist, a brewer, a local activist, which we'll talk about in a moment, a musician. He composed a bit of music and was the church organist at both St Mary's and Holy Trinity Church. He, in later years, was very closely involved in spiritualism, and an inventor and a writer. The inventor bit is sort of quite interesting because I suppose in his role as chemist, in 1857 he's reputed to have been the person who invented the carbonated drink. So the orange pop that we all know today is reputedly all down to him. He invented this, he says, in 1857. And a couple of years after that, 1859, he gave up his job as a chemist in South Street and moved to the top of the street, really to where Bibendum is now, and bought an existing brewery that was on the site, and renamed, of course, Cooper's Brewery. And very quickly expanded into a number of hotels and public houses to sell his beers, etc. And this is one of his early acquisitions. This is where the NatWest Bank is now, on the corner of Terminus Road and Cornfield Road. Started off as a private house, but Cooper bought it and turned it into the Railway Hotel, later to become the Royal Hotel. Bought some premises down the road, and this is in what was called Junction Road at the time. It's really at the back of where Sainsbury's is now in the Beacon development, just on the other side of Ashford Road. And this was in 1870, and it's at this time, particularly after the death of his wife, that he became very interested in spiritualism and lost interest in this part of the business and gave it over to his 2 sons to run, who didn't do particularly well. And the brewery was actually sold off about 5 years later, and this particular building became Eastbourne's electricity generating station, believe it or not. So as an activist, he was a member, in fact an overseer of the local board, the sort of local committee that preceded the borough council. And he actually sort of took on the Duke of Devonshire and his plans for Eastbourne because the town was always incredibly respectful of the Duke and what he said would normally go. But Cooper actually took him on and said, this isn't good enough. These roads aren't wide enough, and particularly some of the lovely boulevards we have today, like Devonshire Place, are as grand as they are because of the pressure that Cooper actually put on the Duke. Prior to 1868, people didn't pay local rates levied by the local board, they paid the rates levied by the church, and this was always a source of great resentment. And in fact it was through the pressure of Cooper that the church rates were actually brought to an end in 1868. And generally he was really quite resentful of what he called the church party, the sort of third force as it were in local affairs, because he thought the church was far too powerful in trying to control everything and make Eastbourne really quite a miserable place, particularly on a Sunday when nothing at all seemed to be allowed. He ended his later days living with his daughter in these premises. This is now a French Greek restaurant, I think, on the corner of Bath Road and Grove Road, and he lived above that shop with his daughter. I think he didn't die impoverished, but he certainly spent the great majority of his wealth in promoting the cause of spiritualism and undertook extensive tours in the United States and spent an absolute fortune on campaigning there. The Caffyns. William Morris Caffyn was articled to his uncle and was apprenticed in the skilled arts of metal making and all of that sort of thing. And he actually started his own business in 1865 as an oil merchant and a hardware merchant, and then went into electrical and gas engineering. And it's these premises here in the middle of the picture. They're situated in Meads Road, just up the road from where the town hall is now, and it's where the turnstile is for the entrance into the Saffron's football ground. So he started here in 1865. Branched out fairly quickly, opened these other premises. This is opposite the Lamb Inn, and as the sign on the building will tell you, they also situated in Seaside Road, near to where the Hippodrome was going to be built. So expanding sort of really quite quickly, again involved in aspects of electricity and gas engineering and metalwork, etc. And in fact, Caffyns were responsible for installing the electric lighting on the pier in 1902. So this is the Caffyn's family with sort of Dad William sort of in the middle, and the two older sons, Harry top left and Percy top right, were the people who really took the business on. In fact, they bought out their father's interest in 1904, I think it was. And they noticed that a lot of rather rich people beginning to come to Eastbourne in these sort of horseless carriages that were very, very temperamental and needed a lot of maintenance and a lot of repair while they were here staying at the upper class hotels. And they actually acquired a former butcher's shop in Seaside Road to start attending to and repairing these cars. The shop was so small it would only take 2 vehicles at any one time, so very quickly they moved to larger premises in the same building. This is at the eastern end of the Colonnade building, where the Tesco Metro is now, opposite the Hippodrome, and their business really took off. And it took off so well that by 1906 they built this. And this is really on the corner of Seaside Road and Seaside. It's now a large traffic island with great yucca plants growing out of the middle of it. 1906, I think an absolutely superb building, a great sort of commercial enterprise, trying to provide every service that a driver would need. And this is bodybuilding, car repair of not only steam cars but electric cars and petrol driven cars. It was the first garage in the country to have an electric lift to take vehicles to the upper floors. So really very enterprising, and then expanded again in 1913, just in time really for the start of the First World War, because during the war this became a place where aircraft were assembled. And I think it's great to see women workers being drawn in. And 75 aircraft were assembled here in the First World War. In the Second World War, I suppose the enemy got their own back and the premises were comprehensively bombed. This is in Grange Road. This is one of the early, what they called at the time, car stables, where cars were garaged overnight. And then just down the road in 1911 they built this building opposite the town hall, which I'm sure you'll recognise. Again, a building of great quality, and this sort of characterises what Caffyn's always did as a company. They always built some really quite fine buildings, and of course above the showrooms here there are all sorts of reception areas and of salons really, where all sorts of fundraising activities and general social activities would take place. They're also present in Terminus Road, and this is now the W.H. Smith shop, and they started here in 1915 with a car showroom with offices above, and by 1923, when the BBC came into being, they actually had a radio room where they actually sold wirelesses for the first time to the folk of Eastbourne. So great emphasis on quality, bodybuilding. They would bodybuild for Rolls-Royce and all sorts of people. By the time we get to the 1930s, Percy's two sons, Edward and Sidney, started to run the company. Sidney more than Edward. Edward went off and pursued a distinguished military career, and he was knighted in the 1960s. In fact, Sidney was knighted about 9 years later in the early 70s, mainly for his contribution to local civil life. This is one of the 1930s building. This was where the big Tesco roundabout is now. It's now Wren Kitchens or something like that. And this was, I think, an absolutely superb Art Deco building with a bodybuilding shop behind, 30,000 square feet, and said to be the best bodybuilding shop in the south of England. And in the 1930s, they really started to expand into other parts of Sussex and into Kent, building up the business. And again, a nice modern building built at Haywards Heath. So starting with his first shop in 1865, we look 100 years later at 1965, and the company had 1,500 employees and £160 million turnover at that time. And now, of course, 55 years later, I'm sure it's even more prosperous than that. Caleb Diplock, what a weird name. Born sort of fairly locally, within sort of 10 miles or so of Eastbourne, the son of an agricultural worker and a baker's assistant, became a brewer and publican, and there's a little story at the end about charitable giving that went wrong. This was one of his first buildings. That building is still there on the corner of Pemsley Road and Terminus Road. Built really as accommodation for all sorts of functions. It was sort of a series of function rooms for dinners and concerts and that sort of thing. It's actually built by a chap called James Peerless, a local builder, who happened to be his cousin. On the ground floor, he operated a very extensive wine merchant's business, and it's said that the cellars for the wine merchant extended right across beneath Pevensey Road, with miles and miles of racking. He was involved in a hotel that he acquired in the early 1860s that was on the corner, on the opposite corner of Pevensey Road and Terminus Road. And here's a nice advert for Diplock's Hotel, and all the comforts of home, and modern tables and electric light and everything else. And this was rebuilt later on in the 1930s, and I'm sure it's a building that you will recognise today. As far as his brewery business is concerned, you're standing outside of the bingo hall in Pevensey Road, looking down towards the top corner of Debenhams, and this was the brewery, the Lion Brewery, that he assembled with its own artesian well. The smaller building on the right is a distillery where, of course, spirits were made, and his own hotel is on the left of the picture. So building a business very, very rapidly, and this is round about 1865, where the Archery public house was built, really in the middle of nowhere at the time. And it's one of a number of public houses that you might be familiar with. This is the original tally-ho that he built at the top of Green Street, since taken down and rebuilt for junction improvements. And here's a place in South Street, the Railway Hotel that you might recognise as the Dolphin today. And of course we've got the Eagle on the corner of South Street and Gildridge Road. He sold the business just a couple of years before he died to Young and Rawley, and they operated it until just after the First World War, when that site in Pevensey Road that was the brewery and the distillery became the Southdown bus station. And finally, a postscript to the story. One of Caleb Diplock's sons was also called Caleb Diplock, which is sort of quite awkward for those who are trying to research the life of the man. And Caleb Diplock the younger outlived his siblings and ended up as really quite a well-off man, living at Southdown Hall at Polegate. He did some charitable work, but did it in a very quiet way. This picture here is of the children's ward at Guy's Hospital, and this in fact was achieved through a donation by him. It was actually called the Caleb Diplock Ward. As I say, he gave his money in a very quiet way, and because he seemed on the outside to be so careful with his money, he was labelled as the meanest man in Sussex. But that was patently not so, because when he died without issue in 1936, he left something like £36 million in today's value to charities and other beneficiaries. And he set up a team of 3 people who would distribute the money on his behalf, which they did to a number of charities. Unbeknown to him, he had far distant relatives, probably fourth cousins and that sort of thing, who actually challenged the will, saying, well, we're, quote, other beneficiaries as well. And it led to one of the longest court cases in UK legal history, which went on for 15 years up until the early 50s, and went to the House of Lords. And in fact, the challengers actually won the case. So there was an embarrassing time in the early 50s when charities who'd received a great deal of money 15 years earlier were actually required to repay some of it. Finally, I want to talk about Frederick Bernard Fowler, born fairly locally in Selmerston, the son of a farmer, and became a pioneer flyer. He worked for a company called Coventry Climax in Coventry, so knew a bit about engines. Started to get very interested in aircraft. It's only in 1909 that Blériot had just sort of flown the Channel, of course. So around about 1911, he approached the council in really his hometown, I suppose, of Eastbourne, and said, I'm very interested in building some planes, and would the council like to come into partnership with me? And the council thought about it and didn't think there was too much of a future in aviation, but said if you want to start a factory, and we don't really have factories in Eastbourne, but if you want to do one, build one on the Crumbles where it's out of the way and nobody's really going to notice. So he went into partnership with a chap called Yates, who by this time was running a little airfield at Wilmington, and they formed the Eastbourne Aviation Company in 1911. And they built this. This is a factory building seaplanes, and this is located where the Sovereign swimming baths are now. Here's a lovely picture showing the desolate Crumbles and the life of the pioneer building these new machines. And here's a nice picture from 1913 where you could actually fly by waterplane from Royal Parade for only £1 a time, which of course was an absolute fortune in those days. And we're moving on to 1914 now, and this map shows the east end of Eastbourne, and the area I'm pointing out here is where the big Tesco is, and this is what we now call Lockbridge Drove. And you can see just to the north of that engine sheds and hangars and all the rest of it, and this was his second enterprise of building land-based planes as opposed to seaplanes. And here's a picture of some of the temporary canvas hangars during the war, because during the First World War this became the principal training school in the country for Navy pilots. No Royal Air Force at this time, of course. And the whole airfield extended to about 250 acres across the marshes, and something like 750 planes were actually built here during the First World War, with a military presence of about 800 men. And here's one of the planes that was built locally. So after the war, there was really no need for any of this business, and Fowler tried to carry on with an aviation school. And here's a picture of one of the first women learning how to fly. But the whole business folded really in the early 1920s. And in 1924, Fowler was asked by the UK government, as a part of a friendship pact with Japan, to go off to Japan and teach Japanese pilots how to attack enemy shipping by dropping torpedoes from aircraft. And that's the end of this little list of enterprising business people who helped to make Eastbourne. Thank you.